This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO Crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here's the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
Welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I'm Kevin Randle. A couple of weeks ago, I had Don Schmitt on the show, and we talked about a variety of topics from crash retrievals and some of the things going on in the world of UFOs today and the change from UAP to UFO and that sort of thing. And the plan had also been to talk about alien abductions, because that's been a significant part of the UFO phenomenon for the last several decades. And we just didn't get a chance to do so. We got off onto other tangents, and I didn't get the conversation directed into abductions. And probably at that point, we wouldn't have had an opportunity to discuss it at the proper length anyway. So I've invited Don Schmitt back to talk about alien abductions. If I could say abductions, it would help. Don Schmitt, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Oh, it's good to be with you, Kevin. Thanks for having me back.
Well, I think, there are always lots of areas to talk about in UFOs, and we could talk about crop circles and cattle mutilations and landing traces and all of this thing, but abductions have taken over or have used an awful lot of the UFO resources. Well, I was going to say researchers, but resources in the last several decades. And I thought it might be interesting to get your opinions of alien abductions and what you think are the best cases, are the good cases of alien abduction, as opposed to cases that are probably manipulated by researchers and that sort of thing. So let's kick it off by asking, what do you think are some of the best of the abduction cases, the ones that most likely would lead into the extraterrestrial?
Well, just like UFOs in general, where as we both, being students of UFO history, we have had a special or a keen eye of looking towards the original, the cases that were very pristine, almost virgin in their interpretation, because there was very little else to, sway or persuade an individual's, account, their descriptions. There was very little reading or TV or movie, that type of thing. And so there was a genuine quality to the eyewitnesses and their testimony. And I think the same would apply towards the most early of the so-called missing time. I don't even call them abduction. I call them missing time experiences, because they had very little outside influence. I'm concerned that within the last number of decades that just about everybody and anybody around the world has read, has seen, has heard, some story of, UFO abduction scenario. And as a result, they have a preconceived, opinion. They have a scenario within their very subconscious of what may have taken place. And as a result, given that over 75% of these cases have to rely on hypnosis to retrieve any form of information, then one has to consider just how accurate is any of the information when it has all been, so thoroughly coached and influenced by outside, stimuli. And so that's why I would, harken back. I think the Antonio Villas-Boas, because it was really one of a kind when it happened down in Brazil. Was it 57, 58? So really, about the first one ever documented. And when I say documented, even medically documented as to that something had happened, that there was a physiological after effect to, at the time, that young farmer who, as I believe, went on to become an attorney years later. and then the Hill case, and mainly due to the investigation, and specifically the hypnotic regression of Dr. Benjamin Simon. And even in as much as he considered the possibility of a shared dream experience, that nonetheless they were describing in many respects the same occurrence, the same event. And there were things that they were able to describe, like the effect on the finish of the car, and things that the scuffings on the top of Barney's shoes, for example. And I think too often we look in the aftermath as a person is struggling for answers and trying to reason as to why were they selected, if that was the case. And so we tend to lump them into, that level of perception as they're trying to discern what happened, if it really did happen. They wrestle with that for the rest of their lives. I can only imagine how the experience may be. And I think too often we've judged Betty Hill specifically because she made it a lifetime preoccupation in trying to, get some final answers.
But can't we say that there's been pop culture references to alien abduction long before the abduction phenomena burst into the UFO field? And I think of things like the really crappy movie Killers from Space. Which
was one that Peter Graves was in?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, that's the complete abduction experience right there laid out in a movie that hit the screens in 1954. Not a very good movie, but certainly all the abduction experiences are there, from the missing time to the unexplained scars to some of the descriptions of what the aliens look like. And we can go back even further in science fiction. And I realize we're limiting the abduction.
Invaders from Mars, as far as with the implants in back of the neck.
Yes, I was going to say that science fiction magazines touched on that topic prior to the 1940s as well. And there was a movie from, I think, 1908 that was the men in the moon had come down to Earth to abduct women. So this idea of alien abduction has permeated our culture for more than 100 years. And I wonder what kind of influences that has on the way the researchers looked at it, and maybe provided unconscious ideas to those who say they've experienced.
Exactly, and that's the word, unconscious. So subliminal, influence as far as whether they were aware of it or not. But again, I think that would also come down to a competent investigation. The movie that we talked about with Peter Graves, I was not even aware of that movie. I did not even see that movie until maybe the late 1990s. I just happened to stumble upon it. And so because it was such a terrible movie, I guess I would ask how many people even have ever seen it.
I will say, when I was living in Cheyenne, Wyoming as a youngster, I saw the movie on the Late Late Show, or whatever they called it at that time. And the thing I remembered was the big eyes chasing him down the road.
Right.
So I mean, I've been aware of it since I was a kid. And you have to wonder how much play it may have gotten on those late, late shows because it probably was very cheap for them to use. But we can also look at things like The Twilight Zone with the episode called Hocus Pocus and Frisbee, where Andy Devine
right.
He's the world's greatest liar, explaining he just was involved in everything, kind of like some of the UFO researchers we've come to know. But and he was abducted by the aliens because they thought, this was the guy that could answer all their questions and give them everything they needed, and he was able to escape from them. But we still have kind of the sort of thing that Barney Hill described in the way of what the aliens look like.
Correct.
With blank faces and the big eyes. And there was a Outer Limits episode called The Bolero Shield, which aired in the early 1960s as well, where they had the same sort of creature type eyes. And I think that some skeptics have linked the Bolero Shield to the Barney Barnett descriptions as opposed to the Twilight Zone, which I think is much closer to an alien abduction.
We always have to be careful, though, and we both know whether it's Rod Serling or, you know, some of his writers like Richard Matheson, who did I Am Legend, you know, that type of storyline, how often we will go back and cite Serling as a futurist. How did he come up with that original idea, given that it now is happening? How did, you know, like certain elements within the original Star Trek series, and we have such things today. So it doesn't automatically disqualify an experience just because there was a past harbinger that, you know, suggested such a, you know, a possibility. But yes, and it was one of the things that Hynek always emphasized within an investigation, especially check out the people's reading material. That if you happen to sit down with them in their front room, and if there was a bookcase or bookshelf, you know, if it's full of UFO books, chances are they're thoroughly schooled on the topic. But if they can, you know, convince you, oh, I've never read anything, I've never seen anything, I'm not attracted to the story, the subject matter whatsoever. UFO movie, I could care less. I've never had any curiosity. And if you walk away and feel that these people are as potentially uncontaminated as you would like potential witnesses to be, then at least it becomes the basis of a potential legitimate investigation.
But you have to remember one thing. Betty Hill actually asked Barney when he was allegedly when they were in the process of being abducted, if he'd been watching The Twilight Zone again.
That's correct, yeah.
And so that suggests that Barney and Betty Hill had some knowledge of the Twilight Zone and what it was. It didn't mean that they never necessarily watched it every week, but they certainly were aware of the programming.
They had, was it Sci-Fi Channel, just ran a Twilight Zone marathon just yesterday. And I honestly, I have DVDs of the Twilight Zone, and over 4th of July weekend and being down in Roswell for the annual festival, and just knowing, getting back to the hotel room, and you could watch Twilight Zone episodes all night if you desired. I actually saw an episode yesterday I had never seen before. So yeah, well, again, investigation would have to establish at least that possible connection. And I think that's where we can assume that may be the case. But just like in a court of law, unless we can actually establish that point, we should just automatically, well, I saw it, so I'm sure they did too.
Well, I think that we have to also remember that some of this stuff sort of circulates in the ether around us. And we become aware of these things without really seeing these things. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I remember is a question came up on Jeopardy about what Hank Hill did. And I knew he had something to do with propane. Mm-hmm, from King of the Hill. I never watched the show, but it was just out there in the ether, and I was able to put these two facts together without really having seen the program. So even though you may not have been a fan of the program, you may have heard somebody talking about it, or you may have seen a preview, or you may have actually watched that particular show. And back in the 1960s, you had like 3 or 4 channels you could watch depending on where you lived. You had the networks and then maybe an independent channel or two. We're going to have to take a quick break. We're going to come back talking more about abductions, I think, here. See what Don thinks there are some other good abductions. Like I say, I always want to thank people who purchased the Best of Project Blue book. If you've liked the book, take a chance and rate it on Amazon. Same thing with Roswell in the 21st Century, Encounters in the Desert. Because that sort of thing helps. And my blog is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, where there's always additional information available about the programming. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. I am here with Don Schmitt. We're talking alien abductions. this time around. When we left, we were looking at the pop cultural influences of it. I'm not sure we finished that topic, but we're going to move on anyway. You mentioned earlier about the influences of hypnotic regression. 75% of the cases are recalled under hypnotic regression, I think was the figure you used.
Right.
How does the hypnotic regression, is that a useful tool in investigations, or is it really more a way of implanting memories?
I think, for example, when it's used in law enforcement, and I remember when Dr. Hynek worked originally with the late Stanley V. Mitchell down in Chicago. And Mitchell was the president of the American Hypnosis Society. And he had developed battlefield hypnosis during the Korean War, that they were able to do surgeries and even amputations if necessary, if one's life depended on it, under nothing more than hypnotic trance, so to speak. And then when I saw video, I saw examples, and I saw the example involving the Chicago Police Department, where a witness to a fleeing vehicle was only able to recall the color of the car. And then under hypnosis, not only the make, the year, but also the license plate number. And it turned out to be absolutely accurate, totally accurate. So,
but on the other side of the coin, there's many police departments, and there's very many states that now reject hypnotically recovered testimony.
Yes, that's being
inaccurate, and the subject under hypnotic regression is easily led. So, right. I wonder how that influences the recovery of the abduction experiences.
Yeah, that is the problem. And in this particular case that I described, because it was obviously substantiated, because it happened to be the guilty party, and the reason they were able to make the apprehension was because with the license number, it provided the owner, the registrant of the car, that type of thing. So, right. I mean, I'm not sure there've been cases, as we know, there've been many law enforcement situations where using faulty information or leading information, they will arrest an easy target, a willing, accused to wrap up a case, that type of thing. And so it always comes down to the competence of the individual. And within the UFO community, I find that it's always been very lacking, in that you've had, whether it was Dr. John Mack, late Dr. John Mack of Harvard, or even Bud Hopkins, who was an artist, or Dr. David Jacobs of Temple University, who's a historian. The idea that the only one that was medically trained to some degree was Dr. John Mack, and yet none of them were proficient in the medical process of regression, whether it be used for smoking or weight reduction, dieting, that type of thing, certain eating disorders. And so I think it's been demonstrated that within, the medical field, that it can be a useful tool in providing someone with the techniques to steer them away from lighting up the next cigarette or having that compulsion to eat that next donut, that type of thing. Okay, fine. But the actual art of retrieving information is, again, if the individual is coached in any way, if there are leading questions that will steer the individual into responding with preconceived answers to, that regression, it's totally false. It's very faulty. And I think
John Mack made an interesting comment. You can read about it in the book Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind by Bryant. And he said it to Russ Estes, Bill Cohn, and me on videotape, which was he was surprised at the matching of the experiencer with the researcher, meaning that
exactly.
that Bud Hopkins got the cold, calculating scientific guys, and John Mack got the aliens with sort of an Eastern philosophy, and David Jacobs got the aliens interested in
infiltrating.
Yes, I was going to say invading, but infiltrating is a better word. But he said there was a curious matching, and I thought he should have flipped it around, because it suggests an influence by the researcher to the people always went in the direction he wanted them to go. I say he wanted them to go.
Exactly, and that was the same argument that when Bud was still alive, when Mac was still alive, that we were confronting them with. The fact that the so-called abductees were reflecting the very persona, the very backgrounds, the very, chase the causes that these people were pursuing. Like in Mac's case, his people all turned out to be very much involved with the environment, environmentalists. They were happy that they were selected. They were vanguards. They were ambassadors who were now assigned to save the earth. And they were waving that environmental flag. And so John was able to then instill this in his minions that he was regressing and working with. And so that was his influence on these abductees. And in Bud Hopkins' case, that they were being violated, they were being raped, they were assaulted, they were being intruded on. Well, his book, Intruders, they come into people's homes, into their bedrooms, and without invitation. And so they were the boogeymen. And in Dave Jacobs, the hybrids, the infiltration, they're taking over at the highest orders of, government and our education institutions, and they're here to take over, all based on the preconceived, as far as belief systems, of the individuals who were supposedly objective, unbiased, and just looking for the facts, man.
Well, I would like to say one thing here. I believe I am the first person to ever report the aliens coming into the homes during an abduction scenario. I was investigating a case that I received from Saga Magazine. I wrote UFO articles for Saga Magazine and UFO Report, and one of the stories inspired a woman in Utah to write to the magazine to get in touch with me. And during the hypnotic regression sessions conducted by James Harder, not by me, she explained how the aliens had come into the house. And I think that's the first time in that magazine article that anybody reported the aliens being in the house. Now we have lots of reports of them coming to the house, and some of them saying, well, it was started in the 50s or the 40s and that sort of thing. But the first time it was ever reported publicly, I'm responsible for it. And
I don't think anyone asked more leading questions than Dr. James Harder of Berkeley.
He was out to prove the Barney and Betty Hill case was true, and the way he was going to prove it was to find other people separated from Barney and Betty Hill with no connection to them, saying basically the same things they did. And we were working together in Utah. I, of course, young and naive and didn't understand all the processes going on there. But between the hypnotic regression sessions with the woman, he would discuss what had happened and other things like that. And he mentioned Betty Hill's examination at one point, and the witness had never brought that up before. And in the next session, she said, I don't remember being examined, but I know I was. And that was a direct result of Harder's, shall we say, implantation of the idea about what the aliens were doing. And
what their purpose, what their agenda was. It was to examine, it was to test, it was to analyze. And what was so disturbing was the last confrontation I had with Harder. And he was trying to convince me that not only are we being visited by a number of different alien races, but I remember that he was claiming that it was over 120. And it's like, and that's the person I would entrust to regress a loved one that I was hoping, at least to get to the bottom of, what may be the underlying, stimulus in all this. and you're working with somebody who's out to prove that you were abducted by aliens, whether you were or not.
Well, the other question that comes up from that is, if there's 120 different alien races abducting people, and they wouldn't be just abducting Americans, they'd be abducting South Americans and Chinese and Asians and Europeans and Africans, probably no Canadians, but certainly abducting people from around the world. Where are all the spaceships parked? You've got to have a huge number of spacecraft parked out there so that they can make all the abductions. And you've got people who claim they've been abducted 50, 60 times. So how many more spacecraft are out there? And each person would probably require a spacecraft, and the logistics of it just simply do not work out, which doesn't mean all cases are ridiculous. It just means that the vast majority kind of fall into the same thing as the UFO sightings.
Very subjective, yes.
The researcher is doing an awful lot of damage. Let me ask you, you're familiar with sleep paralysis, of course.
Oh, absolutely. I've experienced it on one occasion. And it's very frightening because you swear you're wide awake and you can't move and you can't cry out and you feel a presence, someone in the room, someone in the bedroom with you. And unless you finally realize what had just transpired, yes, it could leave that lasting effect that, oh my God, and then you fall into the hands of someone who creates the impression that, well, you may have had an actual encounter, you may have been visited, you may have been abducted. And so I experienced it myself, so I could see how, again, as far as a false sense of assurance that it involves something else, that you could come away believing, yes, I'm one of these abductees. I need a support group.
Or I need a researcher to help me out.
Right.
Bud Hopkins said that he never led the witnesses. He was very careful about doing that. And I did an article which appears on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I did that just so I could make that point, to show where he'd led a witness. So I went through his books and I found the perfect example of that, him leading the witness, sort of the challenge accepted type thing. But you see that the operator, the hypnotist, isn't fully cognizant of the way he or she is leading the witness with the questions that are being asked. When the witness would say, well, I don't remember anything more, describe something like you just did about sleep paralysis. I couldn't move, there was an alien, there was something in the room with me, that sort of thing. But that's all I remember. And the next question would be, you can remember more about that. Tell me more. Let's go deeper. Let's pretend you're on an escalator. You'll go deeper into this trance, and then it's in another room, and you can see over the wall what's going on. And that in and of itself suggests to the witness there's something more to be told, something more to be talked about, and that they are now attempting to come up with additional memories to please the operator, please the hypnotist.
Exactly. We worked on, and Dr. Hynek, when we had worked on a number of cases, and we would constantly have an individual apologizing if there was nothing there.
Let me interrupt here, Don, because I just noticed we're going to have to take our break. So
very good.
We'll come back to Dr. Hynek and that experience here in just a moment. You are listening to a different perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, and I want to mention that there are many good programs on the network. So take a look at the listings on the website, and you'll find something that will interest you. And we will be back right after this, so please stick around. I am joined by Don Schmitt. We're talking alien abductions. When we went away, you were mentioning that Hynek had observed some of this leading of the witnesses, and I had to cut you off in the middle of a sentence there. So pick it up from that point, please.
Well, I think just interviewing witnesses in general, that we have to catch ourselves that we find ourselves at times trying to fill in the voids, and we're not doing the witness any favors. And with Hynek, at times we would have potential missing time experiencers who, well, I don't really think there's anything there, and I just don't want to waste your time. And if we come up empty-handed, if it's just something mundane, I feel that I'm disappointed you. And it would be a constant, assurance from us saying, no. You are, our main concern, that better that we come up with nothing than something that is going to require potentially professional help down the road if it's something very traumatic. We at times were involved with cases that suggested, family incest, for example, that the violator was far from alien, that it was a loved one, babysitting or something. And that's one of the reasons that more times than not, it's always been, our policy, if it's nothing that is bothering you, if you're not having, nightmares or reoccurring dreams that are disrupting your sleep, you're becoming, an insomniac, or, you have a fear zone, you drive by a stretch of road back and forth to work, and, you're very uncomfortable by it, that type of thing. Otherwise, leave it alone, because you may open up a Pandora's box that then the investigator should be held responsible, because in pursuit of just, the data, the information, when you really think about it, how much of it has been compiled that really demonstrate the reality of the abduction phenomena to begin with? That there are patterns, that there are things that, aside from being influenced and subliminally, as far as within one's subconscious describing such occurrences, that we can go and document something like Project Stork with, statistical analysis, that type of thing. And so more times than not, 99% of the time, I would say, leave it alone. Don't even think about it, because there's very seldom a healthy outcome to it, especially, again, in the hands of these researchers who are, using the individual for their own fame and fortune, so to speak.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I did a book called Conversations, which started out with a woman who believed she had been abducted. And we inadvertently moved it into a past life regression. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And a fascinating look at it. She seemed to have information about some of the cases in the past that you and I could find today easily on the internet. But at the time this was taking place, the internet didn't exist the way it was.
Okay.
And you could not go, you'd have to go to various libraries to gather the kind of information she seemed to have about some of these circumstances in her life. But we realized early on that it had nothing to do with alien abduction. And the fellow I was working with on the hypnotic regressions, we had discussed before we started the investigation that we were going to be very careful we didn't ask any leading questions, realizing that that's a really difficult task. But she spontaneously provided these memories. It's kind of like the Bridie Murphy case, where the woman in Colorado, the guy had learned hypnosis, and he was at a party playing around with it, and inadvertently got the woman there to relive an experience as a woman named Bridie Murphy in Ireland some 50 or 75 years earlier.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting case there. And so we ended up with the same sort of thing of a woman explaining various past lives to us. with information that should not have been readily available to her at the time, although in today's environment it would have been. But the book, I think, is interesting, if for nothing else, for the details of some of the historical events mentioned in it. The opening chapter for the book is on my website, www.thesciencefictionsite.com, for those of you who would like to take a look and see if that's something that interests you. But it's kind of the same thing. She was having some trouble, and we were able to eliminate her anxieties by delving into these sorts of things, and by comforting her in that way, we were able to make her a much happier person, and that she didn't have to worry about this stuff. And we recorded the sessions, and we left them. We told her, we're not going to tell you what happened in this session. When we were through, we will give you everything, and you will know everything. And then it's up to you what you want to do with it.
Absolutely, and it's a fine example as far as where hypnosis can be used, especially for creating a mental block, for example, that if there's a traumatic experience that from the subconscious keeps resurfacing, keeps, coming to mind day after day after day, that you can literally think the doctor can create that wall, that barrier, that it becomes not only a distant memory, but it's as though it slowly gets pushed out of the very psyche of the individual. So we've seen that. And these aren't UFO experiences, but again, as far as with incompetent hands, that hypnosis can be a most useful tool.
But the other thing is, you cannot be a therapist or a researcher
or an artist.
You have to take one track and not the other, because the research sometimes collides with the therapy.
Exactly.
I don't think some of the people conducting these hypnotic regression sessions understand that as well as they should, and lead to even more trauma.
Exactly.
With the victim of the hypnotic regression.
We both recall. I mean, there were, and Harder was a good example of this, where they would do conventions, and they would travel throughout the country, seeking, and as I would say, they were seeking victims. They were seeking out people that would describe a close encounter, something that, well, maybe we can flesh something deeper. We can get something else, within your subconscious. And if you come up to my room, tonight, we can do some regression. And they would leave the person stone cold, that they would open up as far as, that portal into, their background, very something, that left an indelible mark as far as on their very, mental condition, and then get on their plane the next day and head home. And here this poor person is sitting there, and what else am I supposed to do? Who else am I supposed to go to? Because the anxiety level has now been elevated to the point, my God, something happened to me. I was potentially violated by somebody, something, and here I'm left hanging with it. Because the researcher was nothing more than looking for the information, not assisting, not helping the individual.
Well, I think we've got a little bit off track here, but I think it's important to look at those aspects of it and understand that the hypnotic regression isn't necessarily a pathway to the truth, nor is it necessarily a pathway to health, especially if it's handled incompetently. But let me ask you this. You mentioned Hubertus, the farmer who was abducted and subjected to a sexual situation on board the craft, some kind of a very crude reproductive experiment, as far as we can tell. Are there other cases? Are there cases that you find interesting that may lead us to alien abduction as opposed to the pitfalls of hypnotic regression?
I think whenever we cite things that we've read, like you talk about, cases that you were personally involved with, and I prefer to do the same thing. And this happened post Hynek, and it was before, we had initiated the Roswell investigation. And we were working with a family from South Chicago who spent weekends. They had a weekend, a summer home up in the Sawyer, Wisconsin, Sawyer County, in the area of Winter, Wisconsin, and it was a husband and wife, their 2 sons, and a neighbor boy. The boys were all teenagers at the time, and they traveled one vehicle. The father needed the car later that evening for a pool tournament he was participating in. And so his wife and 3 boys just went out to get a pizza. And it's so typical, in the northern Wisconsin areas, you look for black bear. You look for bear at the local dump sites where the bears come after nighttime and they start feeding in the garbage, dumped at the site. And they crossed a bridge at one point. They were eating pizza. And the next thing, they had no recollection, or at least 3 of them had no recollection of the remainder of the drive back to the house. Well, they arrived home. They arrived back at the cabin, and the father was pacing out in the driveway. He was just getting ready to call up the sheriff because they were 2 hours late. And they just kind of laughed it off. And they went into the living room and turned on the TV. And his wife went into the kitchen, and she came out dumbfounded because she looked at the clock, and it was 11:30 at night, and the kids are all anxious because there's a test pattern on the TV screen. Everything had signed off for the day. And he missed the pool tournament. He had missed the pool tournament because they were 2 hours late. Okay, so under regression, we only worked with her. She described that after they crossed the bridge, that the car stalls. And the next thing, they see shadows coming from both sides down as far as a hill leading to the road. She describes how her 2 sons and her are led out of the car, and they left the neighbor boy in the car, fast asleep, oblivious to what was about to happen, that type of thing. What was most curious to us, though, was the aftermath. And in talking especially to her husband and the boys, she was a practicing nurse at the time. And all at once she develops this interest in quantum physics and celestial mechanics. And she is reading these books night after night in their bed as he's trying to sleep. And, she's becoming an instant, as far as nuclear physicist, so to speak. And then one day she takes off. She just leaves. And the family has never seen or heard of her since. So I'm left thinking, am I partly responsible for that? Because we didn't have to investigate this. We didn't have to follow up on this. And we certainly did not have to have her hypnotically regressed. So there again, as impartial as we tried to be, as much as we tried to allow her and her family tell us the story. But I think the best thing was, Kevin, in that you had the husband that could verify the missing time, and that you had her 2 sons who also, were at least witnesses to the fact that we have a couple hours we can't account for.
Did you ever find out what happened to the woman?
No. And I stayed in regular contact with him, mainly for the reason that, again, is there anything we can do? Is there anything we can do to help? Because, in many ways, I feel responsible for this.
Well, let me break in here because we got to take a break.
Oh, that's a good reason.
Once again, we've run out of time. I'm talking with Don Schmitt. We're talking about alien abductions. My books are Encounter in the Desert, Roswell in the 21st Century, and the Best of Project Blue Book. Don's books deal with the UFOs, deal with the Roswell case, working with Tom Carey on those books as well. You can find it on Amazon. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. I are talking about alien abductions. And I wondered if there were cases that he found particularly persuasive. I'm wondering about Travis Walton, Pascagoula, some of the sort of one-offs. I've talked to Calvin Parker from Pascagoula a couple of times. I've met Travis Walton and Mike Rogers on occasion, and Mike Rogers has been on this program. So I wondered, what are your feelings on those cases?
Well, I know there's a rift presently between Mike Rogers and Travis.
Apparently the rift has been healed.
Okay, good, because I always felt it was more personal than, and the thing is, I think we both were concerned that he might do something that could damage the event itself.
Well, for those of interested, I stuck my nose into the rift between Rogers and Travis Walton, and there are a number of blog postings in the last month or 6 weeks about that, including the fact that they seem to reconciliated.
Good. I think, and mainly for the fact that they've known each other for
forever,
almost 50 years. So, but I've never considered the Walton case an abduction as much as somebody who was at the wrong place at the wrong time, got too close, got zapped, and they, as I would say, they took the paddles, they put the paddles to them, they revived them, they brought them back. So it's different in that regard. I've met Calvin myself. I've met the late Charlie Hickson before that, and I find Calvin very believable. Is down to earth, an individual you could ever meet. In many respects, I know he's in poor health at the moment, so we all wish him well.
I will break in here to say that he is out of the hospital now and he's home and apparently is recovering. And that's the latest word I have, like 2 or 3 days ago.
Yes, and that's wonderful because it is something life-threatening in that regard. And but you talk about someone for almost 50 years was totally unassuming, who just wanted to wash his hands of the entire experience and had a difficult time, keeping a job and, just maintaining his daily sanity. But I think one of the most telling things with the Hickson Parker Pascagoula case, which even impressed Hynek, was that at the local sheriff or the police department, when they were in the holding area and they had a tape recorder with the thought that...
Well, when you say they had a tape recorder, you mean the sheriff's department had a tape recorder and neither Hickson nor Parker knew it was running? Correct.
I'm glad you clarified that. And the point being that they could have, been joking or confessing as far as, we might get caught, and, maybe we should, back down from the... But the fact that... I think Hickson was, just beside himself, and then Calvin was praying out loud, and they were, for two individuals that they essentially behaved the same way, and that one didn't betray the other. In other words, they were as spontaneous and genuine as one would expect two people to be in that type of a situation. And that in recent years, as you know, too, that there have been a couple of additional witnesses who described seeing something that night across from the river, something touched down, that type of thing. So Calvin, again, if one were to speak of someone who was truly the salt of the earth, somebody that really has never done anything up to this point to capitalize or gain from the experience, it would be the likes of a Calvin Parker.
I think we have to remember that the witnesses that have come forward or been found now weren't available in 1973 when this happened.
Right.
And I'm always a little bit concerned with witnesses who sort of jump on the bandwagon so late. But I understand, of course, the reluctance, especially in the 70s, of coming forward with a UFO story because of the curtain of ridicule that often was brought down on people who claimed to have seen UFOs, let alone seen something that would have been like the Hickson Parker abduction. I'm always a little concerned that they didn't come forward sooner. But from what I understand, there is a number of different people who have been located that are able to provide some sort of more information about what happened, and so the case takes on a little bit more credibility in that sense. But I still am concerned about the idea of the abduction itself. I mean, not necessarily the Hickson Park abduction or the Walton abduction, which, by the way, I think of these as targets of opportunity. Villas Boas, the Hills, Pascagoula, Walton, they were outside, they were sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were targets of opportunity, as opposed to the other witnesses who come forward and have the longitudinal studies going on, where they're abducted from childhood through adulthood and that sort of thing. I find the targets of opportunity being somewhat more credible than those kinds of tales.
Absolutely, absolutely, and also much to both Hickson and Parker's credit, the fact that they described beings that were totally unlike anything described heretofore or since, for that matter. So they were taking quite a chance by that. Just as so nice, again, 75% of these people have no recall. And then what eventually transpires as a result of regression, of hypnosis. Who's to say that all of this imagery, everything that these people describe, has not only been influenced by the investigator or by prior contact with such stories, or if we accept, an alien interaction at all, who's to say that these images aren't implanted into their memories, into their subconscious? And that's all part of the smokescreen, that if we're truly dealing with an intelligence off the planet, so to speak, that they also would control their perception of what is witnessed. I think that's why 10 people see a UFO, you have 10 different versions, 10 different accounts. So I think the same could easily be said regarding these so-called missing time experiences.
Well, we do have to look at the influence of pop culture,
Absolutely.
Especially in today's environment, but even back in the 1970s, because as I mentioned before, there's been an awful lot of television programs and movies and books talking about these sorts of scenarios in a fictional realm. And
I think that's one of the reasons that wave, that summer wave of 1947, was so pristine, in that even leading up to that point, whether Hollywood, whether science fiction at that time, what was the typical, depiction of an alien spaceship? It was a rocket. It wasn't until that summer wave that we even came up with the very term flying saucer, based on the eyewitness accounts. So everything since then has been, heavily influenced by the pulp culture.
Well, not necessarily the pulp culture, but Hollywood and everything else. I mean, the Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Spielberg, was a massive production that of course was everywhere.
1977, and the skeptics were forewarning us that we were going to have a major wave of sightings as a result, like at Kufos, that everybody and anybody was going to start seeing UFOs. Well, we did get a big upswing in case reports at the time, but they, as Hynek would say, they were oldie cases, oldie but goodies. They weren't of anything recent, contemporary. They were typically of old cases that they finally had a reservoir. They had some place that they could go to submit such a case report, because it was already 8 years or 9 years after the Air Force had bowed out.
Well, here's something that I thought about when we talk about the UFO waves, that one report generates all these other reports, as if there's some kind of an influence there. And I've always thought of it as kind of what you were saying there, is that one report gets national or local coverage on the news media, and the people who have had similar experiences now say, oh, I can talk about what I've seen, and I know where to go to report this sort of thing. So that you do get an upswing in the reports, not necessarily because of an influence of that particular report, but they now know where they can go to report what they have seen. So you get a kind of an artificial uptick in the swings, in the sightings.
And especially without the ridicule.
Yes.
The taboo, as far as mention of the very, phrase. And so, and I think it's long, accepted that the vast majority of sightings go unreported.
Well, because people don't want to be ridiculed, and they see other people have seen the things, so they're thinking, well, now there's I guess safety in numbers. I can come out and say what I'd seen. There was an experiment done in New Jersey just a few years ago where guys were tying railroad flares to balloons, weather balloons, and sending them off to see if they could generate UFO reports. And what I found interesting here, the reason I bring this up, is that the witnesses to the balloons pretty much knew what they were looking at. They would say, well, I saw something strange and it did this and this. One of the witnesses was interviewed on Fox television, I remember, and the commentator says, oh, look, it's flashing your lights. And she said, no, it's passing behind a tree. And that's why you're getting that flashing of the lights. And a number of witnesses said, well, I saw this strange light, but it looked an awful lot like a flare or a balloon of some kind. So they understood what they were looking at. So I think we're more sophisticated in today's environment as well.
Well, then, and even back in I think it was the mid-50s, that the Air Force and Blue Book was involved. They conducted a test over Florida where they dropped sheets of red foil in a nighttime sky. And sure enough, they got a preponderance of reports, people calling in, and they were describing seeing red sheets of foil. They knew exactly what they were looking at. So we have to always accept that people in many respects are going to report exactly what they see.
And we have to be careful of the influence of the investigators taking it to somewhere it shouldn't be going.
More than ever. And as we both know, that whenever we hear reports today, we are quick to dismiss them as being one of ours, something that obviously is of our technology. And I think, again, it's one of the reasons that we love history, because the sky wasn't so advanced 50, 60, 70 years ago.
There's an awful lot that we can take a look at. Well, Don, we've run out of time once again. I can't believe this happens, but it does. Want to thank you for taking time to visit your books. Where can we find your books? Where can we find information?
All editions of, I think we have about 6 books that are presently still in print and available at Barnes & Noble, and certainly Amazon.com, and our website, RoswellInvestigator.com.
Thank you much, Don. We'll be in touch.
Kevin.
We'll do it again real soon.
Look forward to it as always.
Okay, thank you. For those interested, my latest book is called UFOs in the Deep State, and it looks at the reasons that UFO secrecy has been maintained. It looks at some of the maneuvers behind the scenes that keep the information hidden, or to distract witnesses from what they're seeing, or public from interest in UFOs. And I think it makes an interesting case for the manipulation of the deep state behind the scenes. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, had I written the book this year instead of last year, I would have pointed out that an awful lot of the people who are in the Biden administration today are the same people who have been in powers in Washington, D.C. For literally decades, from the Clintons to the Bushes to the Obamas. It's the same people running the show again, and they have their own agendas of what's going on. And I think we see some of that manipulation, and we can see it influenced in the world of the UFOs. And also, I think Roswell in the 21st century gives you a good look at Roswell as a cold case, and maybe presents a little bit different perspective on the information about Roswell. The blog is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. There's information about this show and other shows on there. Those interested in my Vietnam experiences, it's www.vietnamgroundzero.blogspot.com. Take a look at that if you're interested in my perceptions of the war. I will be back in about 167 hours with a new show, so I want to thank you all for tuning in.